And welcome everyone to our Thursday night digital discussion with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. My name is John Harry. I am the Programs and Marketing Fellow at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We have a just fantastically Thirsty Thursday themed Oktoberfest-a-thon talk tonight with Ben Barbera, our curator right below me here, talking about the beer and breweries of Old Milwaukee and all the cool stuff we have at the Society to do with beer. Before we get into what Ben's going to talk about tonight, just want to make some announcements about what's to come still. We have a bike tour about the founding fathers of Milwaukee, if you will, and the bridges that keep the city together and apart at different times. The bike tour is Saturday morning. It's our one of our last bike tours of the season, and there are limited tickets available still. So if you want those, hit up our Facebook page or MilwaukeeHistory.net. But yeah, there's just a few tickets left for that bike tour on Saturday morning. It's a great socially distanced way to enjoy the city and get out and ride a bike while the weather's still good. Next week's digital discussion, so same time right here, Thursday, is Genealogy 101, how to find your family story at Milwaukee County Historical Society with our assistant archivist, Steve Schaffer. A lot of people ask about how you can do genealogy and how you get started in the first place. And Steve is going to tell you all the tricks and tips of using our archives and figuring out, where you come from. If we can help you at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, that's fantastic. Also, one last thing is that our politics exhibit, Better, Bigger, Brighter, 150 Years of Milwaukee Politics, is on exhibit. You can see it in person, socially distanced, safe, and everything at the Historical Society downtown through November. So make sure that you get that while you can. It's obviously very topical right now in the political season that we're in. Enough out of me, though. Somebody gave me an angry face over the political thing. I know.
Oh, no.
They're like, stop talking, get out of here. Ben Barbera, talking, our curator at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, talking about the beer and breweries of Old Milwaukee. So Prost to you, Ben, and we'll have a question and answer at the end, so make sure you put those questions in the comments. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the introduction and the really groovy graphics at the beginning. That's great. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. John approached me and said, hey, it's Oktoberfest. Let's do something about beer. And I said, okay, why not beer? I talk about beer quite a bit, so this is great. So this is a little bit different version of a talk that I have done in the past, kind of detailing Milwaukee's beer and brewing history. This is going to be more of an overview. So for you hardcore beer historians out there, yes, I'm going to leave out some details. I admit to it. But this will be something that people who are new to the history or people who just want to tune in and learn some interesting things about Milwaukee's beer and brewing, they will enjoy very much. So as we go through this talk, some themes are going to emerge. Some somewhat funny, some not so funny, but it's amazing how these themes sort of repeat themselves through this story. If you happen to be enjoying some of Milwaukee's finest at this time, then I encourage you to join us in a little interactive activity. Play along, if you will. Every time one of these themes pops up, take a drink, see what happens. It could be fun. So, some of the themes that we will be touching on today. It is good to marry into a brewery. Hopefully a brewer's daughter, but if not, his widow will do. And I'm not trying to be sexist here. It's just the fact is, in the history of Milwaukee breweries, it was all men marrying into breweries through daughters and widows. So if there's an opportunity for a woman to marry into a brewery, I absolutely would encourage it 100%. If you are a principal figure in a brewery, don't travel. You're safer at home. Especially don't go to Germany or California. You will see why. Milwaukeeans like beer. We all know that. They like making it, and we're going to see that they like making a lot of it. They, of course, like drinking it. As you can see here, this very fine crowd here enjoying themselves. And they especially like drinking it outdoors. This would be a beer garden, a very nice beer garden. And lastly, what was once good can become good again. Just watch, you'll see. All right, so what we have here is the original Wisconsin brewery and tavern and beer garden. This is where it all started in Wisconsin, the farmhouse brewery. Generally, it was the wife, the homemaker, who would brew beer for the family. Pretty much everybody drank it. The kids would drink near beer. Or light beer, sorry. Small beer, that's the word, small beer, which is basically watered down beer. Everybody else would drink it as well. It was one of the safer beverages at the time. And this is where brewing in Wisconsin really took off. So, as I said, the first breweries in Wisconsin were in the farmhouse. The first sort of commercial breweries emerged soon after European Americans began settling in Wisconsin. And, though Milwaukee is the beer capital of the United States and arguably the world, it was not the home of the first breweries in Wisconsin. The very first one that we know of was the John Phillips Brewery in Mineral Point, followed up by the brewery in Elk Grove in 1836. However, it did not take Milwaukee long to emerge as a brewing center. And there's really three main reasons for that. One is water. You need a lot of water to make beer. And Milwaukee, being situated where it was, had access to a lot of water. We had the big lake, which was a source of water, but also a source of transportation so that you could move goods and products to and from the brewing operations. We had lots of rivers, and we had smaller lakes where you could farm ice, as you can see in one of the photographs here on the screen at the bottom. This is an ice cutting operation. They would use this ice to keep beer cold, which was essential for making lager, which was what Milwaukee was known for. Lager needs a long time to sit and rest, and without ice, you could only make it in certain times of the year. Lager leads me to the second point, which is German population. It was the fact that many Germans here, many Germans settled here, many of them with brewing knowledge, some of them with extensive brewing knowledge. And they found, again, a source of water and ice and realized that they could do lager here. And lager soon caught on. Prior to that, most Americans had been drinking English-style beers, porters, ales, things like that. But the lighter, easier drinking lager quickly became popular. And the German population really was central to Milwaukee becoming the beer capital. And last was geography. Milwaukee was well situated. It was able to take grain and hops. We have a picture of a hops farm here on the right of your screen. So grain and hops came from the farms inland. We had the water, as I mentioned, and we had several cliffs, or not cliffs, but bluffs in Milwaukee, so it was easier to dig caves. Caves were also essential for storing the lager beer while it aged. And then located on the lake and near to Chicago made it easy once the breweries got larger to become shipping brewers and ship their product across the country. So the first breweries in Milwaukee. The first brewery opened in 1840. By 1859, there were at least 35 independent breweries in the city. Following Civil War, through consolidation, mergers, things just closing because a lot of these breweries were neighborhood breweries, numbers dropped rapidly, but the size of the breweries grew extensively as well. The first established brewery in Milwaukee was started by Simon Rudelshofer. I hope I say that right. And he built his first brewery at Hanover and Virginia Streets, which would now be South 3rd and West Virginia Streets. And he started his brewery in 1940. We'll get to the controversy of whether this was the first brewery or not in a moment. But his saga is kind of a sad one. He accidentally transferred the brewery to John B. Meyer, who gave him a contract that Rudelshofer thought was just a transfer, thought it was a mortgage, but it was in fact a transfer of deed. Rudelshofer did not read German, only read German, did not read English, and so did not know what it was. So John B. Meyer tricked him. When Rudelshofer figured out that he'd been tricked, he went after John B. Meyer and understandably raised a fuss, at which point John B. Meyer beat him. So he lost his brewery and he got beat down. Meyer, realizing that he could be in legal trouble, quickly transferred the brewery to his father-in-law, Francis Newkirk, who took over. He ran the brewery for several years, and then by 1859, he had shifted ownership to C.T. Melms, his son-in-law. If you paid attention to the themes, it is time to take a sip, who had married Newkirk's daughter. In 1860, C.T. Melm's company was the highest grossing brewery in the city. So we had this little German brewery that was swindled away, transferred ownership a couple of times, and by 1860, it was the biggest brewery in the city. C.T. Melms died in 1869 from an infection. He had punctured his hand, and the Philip Best Company, which would become Pabst, purchased the brewery in 1870 and renamed it the Best Southside Brewery. So these images here, the one that kind of looks like the building's burnt, it's not. It's just a very old photo that's got some damage. That's the brewery. The other one was C.T. Melms's house, built outside the brewery, which will come up again in a moment. The other early brewery, and this one is often credited as being the first brewery in Milwaukee, was the Milwaukee Brewery, which soon became known as the Lake Brewery. And this was started by Richard Owens with a couple of partners. And the reason that it's often thought that this was the first brewery is that there was a newspaper account from 1840 of these men buying barley, most likely to make beer. But esteemed beer historian Len Jurgensen did some research and realized that these partners did not purchase their land for their brewery until 1841. So they may possibly have been brewing beer, but they didn't actually have an established brewery until they had purchased the land in 1841. This brewery was specialized in the typical sort of English beers, ale, porter, and also made Scotch whiskey. So you'll often read in Milwaukee histories how the first brewery in Milwaukee wasn't even a German brewery. But according to Len Jurgensen's research, it was in fact a German brewery. In 1850, Richard Owens bought out his partners, and then he later sold the brewing business and retained the property for a while. The brewery ultimately closed in 1880, yet another one of those shutting down after the Civil War. This is a picture of the Jung Brewing Company employees. We have so many pictures like this in our collection of all the employees sitting around. This one is colorized, which is very nice. Usually you see management down in the front. You usually see a sample of the wares, in this case, number of bottles of beer, a nice lithograph of the brewery, and then the employees standing around in the back. The best thing about these lithographs, and it's hard to tell in this one, but we have many of them in our collection, is they often paint this really beautiful picture of what the area around the brewery looks like. And you see people out there dressed in their best clothes, riding in their carriages and stuff like that, when you know, in fact, that those places were smoky and dirty and smelled bad. But, you know, that's what advertising is all about, right? So this brewery, which ultimately became the Falk, Jung, and Borchert Brewery, has sort of a twisted past that I'm only going to briefly touch on here in the interest of time. But in 1855, Franz Falk and Frederick Goes operated a malting business in what was the Eagle Brewery at that time. They soon opened another brewery on the south side, and this was going fairly well. At the same time, or soon after that, Fred Borchert Jr. purchased another brewery in Milwaukee, the Stoltz Union Brewery, and in 1879, Philip Jung joined. Several years later, the breweries all joined hands, creating the Falk, Jung, and Borchert Brewing Company, which soon challenged Blatz as the third largest in Milwaukee. So at that time, Philip Best, which in 1889 became Pabst, Schlitz, and Blatz were the top three, but the Falk, Jung, and Borchert brewery was close behind. Miller was lagging a little bit behind them, but was doing just fine. Fires in 1889 and 1892 proved to be too much for the company. They came back after the 1889 fire, but the 1892 fire destroyed too much of the infrastructure, and Pabst Brewing Company purchased the brewery. Philip Jung wasn't done, though. He went on to purchase the Oberman Brewing Company, which had been established many years earlier by Jacob Oberman, and renamed it the Philip Jung Brewing Company in 1899. And that company made it all the way until Prohibition, closing at that time. Incidentally, the last remaining building from what had been the Oberman Brewery and became the Philip Jung Brewery was not torn down until 2005. So there were these other major breweries, and we'll talk about some other big ones afterwards. But really, what Milwaukee's known for are the big four. So this would be Pabst, Schlitz, Miller, and Blatz. These are the four companies that, made Milwaukee famous, put Milwaukee on the map as a beer capital. And there's two significant factors that help these breweries take off. The first one, bad for Chicago, good for us, was the 1871 Chicago fire. That fire destroyed many of the breweries in Chicago, and Chicago has always been a beer thirsty town and is still today. In fact, I believe Miller sends more of their beer to Chicago than anywhere else in the country. So when the fire happened, the breweries in Milwaukee realized that this was a time to step up their shipping and send beer down to Chicago and fill a need. So they immediately, as soon as they heard word of the fire, immediately started loading up rail cars and ships and sending beer down that way. Eventually, Schlitz shipped so much beer that that's where they came up with their slogan, "The beer that made Milwaukee famous." Both of these breweries, as well as Miller and Blatz, but especially Schlitz, also bought a lot of property in Chicago, and there were a lot of tied houses. These are bars that belonged to a brewery and then were leased to a saloon keeper, but with the expectation that they would only serve the brewery's beer. The other big factor that helped the Big Four take off was industrialization. In this period, mechanical refrigeration became feasible, and so now it was much easier to keep that lager beer cold and ship it all over the country. It used to be that in summertime you couldn't really ship lager. Milwaukee had a bit of an advantage in this because they had ice year round and they could pack it in ice, but with mechanical refrigeration that solved a lot of that problems. Pasteurization meant that when the beer got to wherever it was going, it didn't explode. You could open it and you could still drink it. And of course, railroads were taking off and crisscrossing the country, making it much easier to move product around. So a little bit about the Big Four. Again, this is a brief overview. We could go much more into detail on these, but we're not going to. So the Pabst Brewery, or what became known as the Pabst Brewery, this was actually established by Jacob Best Sr. He and several of his sons established a brewery in 1844. Most of the sons went off to try their hands in other breweries, other businesses, but Philip Best stayed and took over sole ownership in 1859. Meanwhile, Frederick Pabst had moved with his family to America in 1848. And Frederick Pabst went to Lake, I guess. He started out as a cabin boy on steamers on Lake Michigan and eventually made his way up to captain. That's why we call him the captain today. And he had a particularly harrowing adventure out at sea. Soon after he had met Maria Best, Philip Best's daughter, he decided to give up the sea, give up the lake. He married Maria in 1862, and he and his now father-in-law, drink by the way, Philip Best, became equal partners in 1864. Philip soon retired in 1866, and he made Pabst and another son of his sons-in-law, Emil Shandine, equal partners in the business. Emil Shandine took over the Southside Brewery, which and moved into C.T. Melms's house, which we saw in an earlier slide. Shandine died in 1888 after traveling to Germany. There's one of those themes again, leaving Pabst in full control. Pabst managed to wait an entire year before he changed the name of the brewery to Pabst Brewing Company, and is famous. That name is famous today. Pabst was a fairly innovative leader with his company, and especially his marketing. The Pabst Blue Ribbon that we all hear about, that was a marketing gambit. It started in 1882. They just started tying the blue ribbons around the bottles of the beer, and the beer became so well known. It was actually Pabst Select, or Best Select, and then Pabst Select became so well known as the beer with the blue ribbon. They just changed the name to Pabst Blue Ribbon. Anyway, Pabst died in 1904 after suffering 2 strokes while traveling to California. So again, another place not to go, but the company lived on. A big part of Pabst's growth was because they were purchasing several smaller breweries. As I mentioned earlier, they purchased the Melms Brewery, they purchased the Falk, Jung, and Borchert Brewery. They also purchased the Western Brewery and several others. The Blue Ribbon, again, as I mentioned, they To our knowledge, Pabst never actually won a blue ribbon. They did win several gold medals and other prizes and awards for their beer, but never a blue ribbon. By 1893, sales had topped 1 million barrels, which made Pabst the largest brewery in the country. And at this point, again, they were shipping all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. When Prohibition hit, Pabst was able to survive by making alternative products, such as Pabst-ett cheese. We see a nice advertisement here for Pabst-ett cheese. The family had invested in some farms and raised prize-winning cattle, and so, of course, cheese was their big venture. They never made any money on cheese, but they put a lot of resources into it. Really, the way these big breweries managed to survive was through their real estate holdings. Pabst had hotels and theaters and buildings all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. Pabst continued to grow after Prohibition, finally peaking in 1978 when they were producing 15.6 million barrels of beer a year. But in the mid 80s, Paul Kolmanovitz of California bought the brewery for 63 million. And the sort of consortium that Paul Kolmanovitz headed up didn't have as much interest in marketing, and Pabst's share started to drop off. By the mid 90s, Pabst was closing its breweries, and finally in 1996, it closed the brewery in Milwaukee, closing so rapidly that a lot of people didn't have time to clean out their lockers or anything like that. Production was shifted to Stroh Brewing Company. And so by 2001, Pabst still existed and owned a number of beer brands, but had no production facilities and did not produce any of its own beer. In 2014, Eugene Kashper bought the brand and all their sub-labels, and Pabst started being produced again in 2015 on a very limited basis locally, while still maintaining external production. Miller Brewing Company. So Charles Best, one of Jacob Best's sons, and Gustav Fine purchased a former brewery in 1849. Their very brief tenure as brewery owners was particularly ugly. By 1854, it was owned by Charles Best and Henry Wild. Henry Wild took out a second mortgage on the brewery without informing his partner, Charles Best, and then did not pay the mortgage and lost the brewery to foreclosure. Frederick Miller, who had just arrived from Germany with $8,000 in gold in his pocket, bought the property at sheriff's auction in 1856. Miller was born in Germany. He had been raised in breweries, had extensive brewing experience before he moved to Milwaukee. Miller, again, lagged behind some of the other breweries a little bit, and he was over on the west side of Milwaukee, in fact, kind of out in the country. So he wasn't in the central brewing district on the beer line that a lot of the other breweries were. And he kind of did things at his own pace. He was innovative in a lot of ways. He started shipping beer to St. Louis the year that he opened the brewery, or maybe the year after. So he started shipping on a small scale fairly early on. And he was sort of a one-man show running the brewery for a long time. And so eventually by 1888, Miller had grown to be the fourth largest brewery in Milwaukee, which made it a significant brewery nationally as well. And then in 1903, they released Miller High Life, and sales really took off from that point on. That same year, when they released Miller High Life, they did it in clear bottles so everybody could see what a pure beer it was. And that's when they also developed the iconic Girl in the Moon symbol that we still know today. During Prohibition, Miller sold typical products, ice, soda, and near beer, and again, relied on their real estate holdings as well. There was a broad labor strike in 1953 that affected a number of the breweries, and Miller was hit particularly hard by this because they did not have outside breweries. They only had the one brewery here in Milwaukee, but they survived. And began realizing they needed to sort of spread their production around and began opening new plants around the country. Miller had remained a family-owned brewery for a long time until finally in the 1960s, Philip Morris took over. And then it began changing hands through all kinds of various conglomerates and consortiums and so on, to the point where today we're often confused about what to call the beer though it still goes by the name Miller Coors. Schlitz, here's another story that fits our themes very well. In 1849, August Krug started a brewery on Chestnut Street, which is today Juneau, between 4th and 5th Street. So this is right in the heart of the beer district. And in 1850, Krug hired Joseph Schlitz as his bookkeeper. Schlitz had been born in Germany, like so many others who were prominent in the brewing in Milwaukee, and arrived in Milwaukee in 1850. Also at that time, Krug's nephew, August Eline, came to live with the family, and this will be important in a minute. August Krug died in 1856, but his wife continued on running the brewery with Schlitz as a manager, and 2 years later, Anna and Joseph Schlitz married. Schlitz, again, tastefully waited a couple of years to change their brewery to his name, Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, in 1861. He also began to purchase breweries nearby and expand operations, greatly ramping up his sales. And as I mentioned earlier, he especially took advantage of the Chicago fire of 1871. By 1873, a couple of the Eline, of Krug's nephews, the Elines, had started to work in the brewery. In 1875, Joseph Schlitz decided to go back to Germany, very bad choice, and his ship sank off the coast of England. His body was never found, though he has a grave and marker at Forest Home Cemetery. After his death, control of the brewery shifted to the Eline brothers, most prominently August Eline, who ran the brewery for a long time and was very successful, turning Schlitz into one of, if not the largest at some points, breweries in the United States. During Prohibition, like many of the others, Schlitz relied on real estate and made alternative products that weren't particularly successful, like E-lines. Get the twist on the name there, candy. They thought the candy was going to take off and built huge production facilities, but it never went anywhere. Nonetheless, after Prohibition, the company took off and was one of the largest in the country. That same 1953 strike caused some problems for Schlitz. Schlitz was also considered a premium beer, which is kind of funny to think now. But what happened after Prohibition, and especially after World War II, is people started drinking at home a lot more. They weren't going to the tavern and buying beers. They were buying six-packs and taking them home. And they started to buy cheaper beers. And so Schlitz looked a little too fancy. And in fact, that's when Schlitz started coming out with some alternative beers like Old Milwaukee to sort of tap into this less premium taste and appeal. Schlitz continued to have good marketing through the 50s and 60s, but in the 1970s, they made some really bad choices. In 1976, in order to cut costs, they messed with their brewing formula, and they claimed it wasn't going to change anything. But if you looked at the beer, you could actually see kind of sediment or it looked like there was stuff in the beer. And even though it was supposedly harmless, nobody wanted to drink beer with essentially chunks in it. And they refused to change back to the previous formula, which really killed their sales. And then finally, a strike in 1981 put the nail in the coffin. Schlitz refused to negotiate and ultimately terminated its employees and closed the brewery in 1981. The label was sold to Stroh Brewing Company in 1982, and in 1999, Pabst purchased much of the holdings, sort of keeping the name in town, if you will. Blatz Brewery, the other of the big four, again, also follows many of the themes that we've talked about. There was a gentleman named John Braun who immigrated to Milwaukee in 1854 and had worked in Francis Newkirk's brewery. If you remember, Francis Newkirk was part of the cabal that took off, took Rudolf's brewery, eventually passing it on to C.T. Melms. In 1846, Braun bought his own land and established his own brewery. Valentin Blatz came from Germany in 1848 to work for Braun, and then established his own brewery next door to Braun's. Braun died rather tragically when he was thrown from his buggy, and soon after he died, Valentin Blatz married his widow. Drink. Blatz merged his brewery with Braun's and then purchased the Washington Brewery, which was nearby, And soon after that, Blatz was the third largest brewery in Milwaukee. Blatz was a real innovator. It was one of the first breweries to do bottling, widespread bottling. It was an innovator in advertising and shipping as well. The brewery continued to expand and won medals. Output reached 250,000 barrels in 1891. So this is lagging fairly far behind Pabst, but it's still a significant brewery. There was a huge sort of conspiracy going on at this time when Blatz sold his holdings to what was called the United States Brewing Company of Chicago, but it was known as the English Syndicate because it was a bunch of brewing interests from England who had put up money. But they retained Valentin Blatz as the director until he died in 1894 while returning from a trip to California. His sons continued to run the brewery for a number of years until Prohibition. And then it passed through a few hands, but eventually post-Prohibition, it just couldn't keep up. And it was put up for sale in the 1950s with Pabst buying the label. Excuse me. But eventually, due to antitrust laws, Pabst had to give up the label, and Heilemann Brewing Company bought it. But now Pabst has the label back again. So of the big four, Miller still obviously today is going strong, and Pabst owns both the Blatz and Schlitz brands. A few other significant breweries. In the interest of time, I'll move through these fairly quickly. This image here is from the 1877 Brewers Convention, which I believe was held in Milwaukee, though I don't know where in Milwaukee would have been a space that looked like this, but this is very much an artist rendering of the event. And then this is one of my favorite pictures. This is right at the end of Prohibition, right after Franklin Roosevelt legalized beer. So before the amendment was repealed, but 3.2 beer had been legalized. And so immediately all the breweries or all the significant breweries in Milwaukee, so Independent Milwaukee Brewery, Pabst, Blatz, Schlitz, Miller, Cream City, and Gettleman sent beer on a special airplane to Roosevelt to thank him for making beer legal. This is a picture of the Schweikart Brewery. They look like a very fun bunch of gentlemen there. George Schweikart purchased a short-lived brewery on Watertown Plank Road. The people who had built the brewery unfortunately succumbed to cholera during a cholera outbreak in 1854. Soon after, Adam Gettleman arrived and became the brewery foreman, and in 1870, he married Schweikart's daughter. In 1874, Schweikart transferred the brewery to Gettleman. It actually passed through a number of hands, but that's the simple version of the story. And by 1887, Gettleman had changed the name of the brewery to the A. Gettleman Brewing Company. During Prohibition, like many of the other breweries, they sold alternative products. But interestingly enough, one of the things they sold was snowplows, because Adam's son was Fritz was a bit of an engineer and a tinkerer, and he had created a snowplow design that was built by Heil, or at least was on Heil trucks, and had also developed a special keg, an aluminum keg as well. He soon became president of the brewery in 1934. When he died in 1954, his sons took over. The 1953 strike hurt the company, and eventually they sold it to their next door neighbor, the Miller Brewing Company, in 1961. And then Miller would occasionally release Gettleman products over the next several decades. Another picture of the Gettleman employees much later now. This is after it's been named A. Gettleman Brewing Company. This picture, I chose this picture because it shows the ad for Cream City in the background. This is almost certainly a tied house here that we're seeing in the back. But I also really liked the carriage full of people dressed very well. I have no idea where they're going, but it must have been someplace nice. This picture would have been roughly 1895, because you can see an advertisement for the Bijou Theater. The show was in Old Kentucky, which was a play that was released in 1893. It came out as a movie in 1927 and again in 1935. Cream City Brewing Company was one of the earlier breweries. It was started in 1853. Again, kind of in that beer and brewing neighborhood just north of downtown. It passed through several hands over the years. But managed to hold on through most of the consolidation that went on in the late 1800s, and made it, and actually survived Prohibition. They became Cream City Beverage Company. But soon after Prohibition, they just couldn't keep it together and folded. The independent Milwaukee Brewing Company was started by a handful of gentlemen in 1900, again located in that main brewing district, and it also survived Prohibition, with the Bills family retaining ownership for a number of years, until 1956, and eventually they were bought out by Heilemann. Heilemann was in a very acquisitive phase in the 1960s, buying many breweries, including Blatz and independent Milwaukee Brewing Company. The Western Brewery was established in 1855. It eventually became, it was interesting because it was really a conglomerate. There was a number of different brewing establishments that ran it. It was destroyed in 1882, or the brewery was destroyed, but they had malting operations going on. And this is where Western Brewery's legacy really is important. Those malting operations eventually became Frederick Brothers Grain and Malting Company. This is a major malting enterprise that was run by William Frederick until his death in 1915. At that time, his son Curtis took over. Now, Curtis had planned to go to medical school. He really wanted to be a doctor, but he felt obligated to take over the company when his father died. And so when Curtis died in 1951, he put a $10 million trust together that was later used to start Frederick Hospital and the Medical College of Milwaukee. Medical College of Wisconsin. That is a typo. So we're going to fast forward to the modern brewing industry. Just a quick overview here. So we had all these major breweries in Milwaukee, making Milwaukee the brewing capital. But by the 1970s, it was really just Schlitz, Pabst, and Miller. And then soon after that, it was really just Miller. And so Milwaukee kind of lost its title as the beer capital. But at the same time as these macro breweries were buying off, we began to start to see the growth of microbreweries and brew pubs. And now some of these so-called microbreweries are popular enough that they really kind of push the boundaries of the micro name. But we still see a number that remain small. When I created the exhibit that this talk is based on, which I was doing the research in 2015, new microbreweries were opening so fast, I eventually had to draw a line because I simply could not keep up with them. It's stabilized a little bit now, but there still are a number of options out there. And so what we see is that what had started as a small craft industry with neighborhood pubs, and then turned into these major, massive industrial complexes, has now returned to that craft brewery, and again the focus on the smaller brew pub or the neighborhood pub. We've really kind of gotten back to that notion of taverns and places as meeting places. Well, pre-COVID at least, right? The other thing that happened is that beer gardens had been immensely popular in Milwaukee, and again we can thank the Germans for this. In the 1800s, these were beautiful places with theaters and rides and all kinds of different shows going on, and some of the best music in town. And this was where people went on Sunday. You know, these were people that worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and their one day of rest was Sunday, and they would go to the beer garden and spend the day in these really sort of luscious parks, listening to music and enjoying family and friends. And we have sort of returned to that beer garden stage now, which is nice to see. Something else that Milwaukee is known for is festivals, and really these two go hand in hand, beer and festivals. Again, we can thank our German heritage. The first major festival in Milwaukee was Mayfest in 1852. 10,000 people attended. There were something like 20,000 people in all of Milwaukee at the time, so half the city attended this festival. It's often considered Milwaukee's first ethnic festival. And they took off from there. The beer gardens had all kinds of festivals and contests. You can see there were shooting contests and singing festivals and gymnastic festivals. The gentleman here on the bottom, that is a bunch of turners, so gymnasts out at the beer garden. enjoying beer. This is a great shot from a festival, very, very Germanic float. I have to think that this is State Fair Park, the racetrack, Milwaukee Mile, but I'm not positive. That tradition of festivals continued, and so one of the big festivals post Prohibition to celebrate the end of Prohibition was Volksfest in 1933. That was sort of an impromptu celebration, but it led Dan Hone and the city to decide to create something called Midsummer Festival in the summer of 1933. And this was a week-long festival that included boat races and concerts, and of course had a beer garden. 500,000 people attended the first year. It was extremely popular. It was held on the lakefront every year for 7 years until the U.S. entered into World War II. And this was really the inspiration for Summerfest. And so, bringing it all together, right? So we've got beer, we've got the Germanic origins, we've got beer gardens and festivals. We've got the reason that John Harry asked me to give this talk was because it's Oktoberfest season. Well, Henry Meyer had been inspired by the Midsummer Festival, and he wanted to create a massive festival on the lakefront on the same sort of idea as Midsummer Festival, but make it even bigger and better and have more acts and more things going on. And it was said that he was particularly inspired by a trip to Munich in 1962 for Oktoberfest. So ultimately, what came out of that was Summerfest, which we have 3 great pictures here of Summerfest, which started in 1968. So there we go. We've got beer, we've got German traditions, we've got beer gardens and outdoor festivals, and it all kind of centers on this, or at least reflects this time of year that we're in right now, this Oktoberfest time. So I encourage everybody to enjoy themselves as much as possible in these sort of fraught times that we're in, and just, you know, go out and have some fun with friends and family as much as you can. So thank you very much for watching, and I will now turn it over to John in case we have any questions.
Wonderful, Ben. Thank you so much for that. The rundown. You know, it's hard to condense that much beer history into one presentation. So
I did my best to skip over all the best parts.
Yeah, right. You gotta pay special admission for those.
Yeah.
So right now is a chance for anybody to ask any questions. If you have any, we got actually a great one because you brought up a lot of the start of the downfall of the Milwaukee beer industry had to do with a strike in 1953. And so David wants to know, could you expand a bit about the labor strikes and the conditions and workers and impact that had on the breweries?
Yeah, absolutely. During some of the worst labor struggles in the 1880s, the brewing industry wasn't quite as affected as much. While they worked hard and were in tough conditions, it wasn't quite as bad as being in heavy industry and manufacturing and things like that. So they didn't play quite the part there. But what happened was the brewing unions were pretty powerful and pretty strong. And of course, they would come to loggerheads with management. And I think that a big factor was, as a lot of these breweries post-Prohibition became less and less family operations and became more owned by corporations, essentially, it became harder and harder for the workers to negotiate. And so the strike in 1953 was a citywide strike affecting all of the breweries. It was led by the union, and it shut down operations. And again, for breweries that couldn't produce beer elsewhere, they lost production for several days, which put a real dent in their works. And 1953 was the big one, but again, 1981 was another broad strike, ultimately killing Schlitz because Schlitz refused to negotiate, whereas the others chose to negotiate.
So in 1981, did all the, I mean, I guess who was left, Pabst and Schlitz at that point, did Pabst,
Miller.
And Miller, did they all strike in 1981 too? Was that a citywide?
My understanding, I don't know for sure. This is something that people who are watching could probably do better than I can to talk on this. But my understanding is that there at least was the threat of a citywide strike. And I thought, and I'm pretty sure negotiations went fairly quickly, except for in the case of Schlitz.
Got it. Paul is chiming in here after the 53 strike. Miller's decided to build a second brewery in California.
Yeah.
So makes sense after that work short stoppage. We had a lot of people chiming in with all the delicious beers that they that they were going through. Your drinking game that you had lined up really set people up.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
It's Thursday, right? It's the first day of the week.
You had to have like a lineup. Yes, somebody's asking, is this recorded? Yes, it's recorded. You can find it at YouTube and our Facebook for the future. So a question I had is, so you talked about like why beer, became one of the major industries or what Milwaukee was known for. But like there were a lot of breweries in a lot of different cities around the United States. St. Louis, Cincinnati. I mean, we talked about the Chicago fire. Boston, New York had its share of breweries and obviously a large population. So why do you think that Milwaukee is the one that's stuck?
That's a good question. I think part of the reason is, this is homerism, but they did it better in a lot of ways. To the point where Milwaukee breweries had to put out cease and desist orders because other breweries were making Milwaukee style beer. They were essentially naming their beer after the city. I mean, so through a combination of a superior product, superior marketing, a very efficient shipping network, Milwaukee beer was known nationwide, and so everybody was just playing catch up from that point on. And yeah, I mean, it's really amazing that some of these smaller breweries in like New York they'd sell Milwaukee beer, trying to capitalize on the name,
which is pretty crazy. It's almost like when like if you hear country music, it's like it's Nashville country. It's the same kind of synonymous thing. Thank God we're known for beer and not country music. Let's just.
And here's another quick funny story. Speaking of suing over a name, Miller in around 1890 made a Budweiser beer. So Budweiser was actually a style of beer. It was based on a Czech style of beer, and so a number of breweries made Budweiser, but Anheuser-Busch obviously was the famous one for making Budweiser, and so Miller produced their own Budweiser for a number of years, and eventually it went to court between Anheuser-Busch and Miller over who got to use the Budweiser name, and well, we know how that came out. But I think Miller did okay for themselves nonetheless.
Well, and if you ever, so you saying that reminded me of one time traveling in Europe, and if you're in the Czech Republic, you can get like Budweiser, the real Budweiser, and this is homerism, but drink that over the Anheuser-Busch.
I'm sure.
Fun. All right. Well, it's always good to talk about beer. It's always good to have Ben Barbera on our Thursday night digital discussions. We do have a lot of the stuff that you talked about is digitized on our website if you search for it too, which is pretty cool. Because how many brewing artifacts does the society have? And I mean, a lot.
Yeah. Just bottles alone were probably around 1,000, and then it goes from there. So the artifact collection, Beer and Brewiana artifact collection is around a couple thousand. The images is several thousand. So it's one of our best collections. It's one of our best organized collections. We have some very rare things that people don't normally get to see. So really, it is a special collection, and it's been a lot of fun to work with.
It's always a big deal when some of that stuff goes on display too. So, Ben, wonderful to talk and have you explore Milwaukee's beer history more with us tonight. And next week, we have our assistant archivist, Steve Schaffer, in for Genealogy 101. So you want to know how to find out more if your family worked in the breweries? That's when you'll find out how to search for that stuff. I guess that'll do it for tonight. So Ben, thanks a lot. Everybody stay safe. And, I've been hiding this the whole time, but it's not going to stay this way. So cheers to everybody and have a good night. We'll see you all next week.
Bye, everybody.